go. G'day everyone. Welcome to week 28 here on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge, coming to you from the great outdoors again, so hopefully the wind stays down. But I'm here in Australia's capital territory, in Canberra, our capital city, and so I thought the title of today's video, a bit of a play on words there. Our national anthem here in Australia says, "Australians all let us rejoice." Well, this week it is Judahites all let us lament. Okay, that's what we're doing as we finish off the Book of Kings, Chronicles and Jeremiah. We're going to read through Lamentations and Habakkuk as we lament the fall of Jerusalem. All right, so that's the period of time that we're in here on our Bible reading plan. Around about 586, some say 587 BC is when Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. This comes as no surprise to us. It was foretold by many prophets. Well, again, we're going to be reading that story this week as Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to the city for about 2.5 years. A great famine takes place. Some horrific events take place there in the city of Jerusalem until he eventually lays charge to the city, destroys the temple, burns the walls down and all his significant buildings, and takes a whole bunch of people away to Babylon in exile. This becomes known as the Babylonian exile, and as Jeremiah has said to us, because Babylon were going to rule in this part of the world for about 70 years, this exile of God's people lasts for around about 70 years. So that is what we are reading this week. Well, let's have a look at the narrative before we then have a look at the poetry in Lamentations and Habakkuk. All right, let's go. The Book of Kings and Chronicles both end with this story, and as we've seen before in previous weeks, they tell the story in slightly different ways. Kings is very much matter of fact. It does use a little bit of poetic language, talks about Judah and Jerusalem being thrust from God's presence, so there's a little bit of poetry in there, but pretty well, very matter of fact. It finishes abruptly with God's people, the last of those 5 kings that we spoke about last week, being taken away by King Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon, and there's this little mention at the end of Nebuchadnezzar, him dying basically, and the next king of Babylon taking charge. That's how Kings finishes. The Book of Chronicles is a little bit more detail and it's a little bit more hopeful because they remember written in a period where it's looking forward to a new king. So it has a little bit of a different tone to it. And the very end of Chronicles, you'll notice, fast forwards a whole 70 years to when Babylon comes down and the Persians take over. So what we notice there is that Chronicles ends where Ezra will pick up. They're basically written or edited at least by the same person. So there's a bit of a copy and paste happening there, but we'll get to that when we read Ezra in a few weeks. Whereas Jeremiah, which we're also finishing this week, tells far more details of the story. Remember, Jeremiah is right there on the ground as it's happening in Jerusalem. And so when we read the narrative of Jeremiah this week, we're going to find out a lot more story about some of the political happenings there in Jerusalem while the siege is taking place. All right. So in Jeremiah this week, we're going to be reading basically 2 sections. Remember, I have cut up Jeremiah slightly, so we're reading 2 sections of Jeremiah this week. The first is basically 6 chapters of narrative from chapter 39 to 45. They're all narrative chapters, all focused on the capture of Jerusalem and Jeremiah's part in that story. Essentially what happens is that after, or as Nebuchadnezzar is leaving with the exiles, he gives Jeremiah the option. Mate, would you like to stay here or do you want to come with us into Babylon? Well, Jeremiah decides to stay. There's a bunch of a remnant group of people that stay behind. Nebuchadnezzar puts a governor in charge, a Babylonian governor basically in charge there. And then what happens is a Jewish guy called Ishmael assassinates this governor. Oh, Babylon are gone. Who cares? He assassinates them. Well, the people panic and they're like, whoa. Nebuchadnezzar's going to find out about this and come back for us. So that remnant escape to Egypt. Jeremiah says, no, let's not go to Egypt. We should stay here in Judah, but they take Jeremiah captive, and this a group of Jewish remnants goes down to Egypt. Well, as far as we know, that's where Jeremiah lived out the last of his days there in Egypt, against his own will, really, because of that assassination on the Babylonian governor. Okay, so you're going to read that. Then what we're going to do is jump ahead to the last few chapters of Jeremiah. 2 of those chapters are dedicated to a prophecy that he gave against Babylon. Okay, Babylon, you might be the ruling power at this time, but your day is coming also, all right? There's a day coming where Babylon will be destroyed. And this prophecy, it turns out, he gave to the exiled people as they left and said, listen, when you get there to Babylon, read this out so they know what's coming for them, all right? And then lastly, oh, there comes the wind. Lastly, in the last chapter of Jeremiah, there's a bit of an addendum stuck on the end of the book, all right? And that's basically a copy and paste of Chronicles. It tells the story of basically the destruction of Jerusalem again. So it's a bit of a repeat, but a copy and paste. And it's just a bit of a postscript from whoever the editor was of Jeremiah, added those words on at the end to kind of sync it with Kings and Chronicles. Okay, so you'll definitely notice that. And then that's it. Congratulations, you've finished Kings, Chronicles and Jeremiah. Huge books, massively significant. Well done. So this brings us now to the poetic element of this week's readings. The prophet Habakkuk comes in, a very little minor prophet, only 3 chapters, and he prophesies before the destruction of Jerusalem. Seems to be written in the decades leading up to this destruction. And Habakkuk, you'll find, is really unique in that he doesn't prophesy against a city. It's actually a book of personal prayer. It's like his personal prayer journal, okay? It's poetry of him saying to God, why on earth is Babylon going to come and take us out? This is terrible, you know? and finishes with him saying, but I know that just as you've done good to us in the past, so you can also restore us. And so, like all the prophets, doom and gloom with hints of hope, that's Habakkuk. But notice it's very personal, okay? This is his personal lament as to what's happening, or what's going to happen with Jerusalem and Judea. Which brings us to Lamentations, which is also a book of, well, lament, okay, the hints there, but very different is that Lamentations, and the 2 Psalms we're reading this week, by the way, as well, are community laments, okay? The Book of Lamentations is a book of poems, 5 chapters and 5 poems that are all designed for a community to grieve together with, okay? We believe Jeremiah had his hand, it certainly was a major influence in this book. And basically, as I said, it's 5 poems. The first 4, interestingly enough, are written as acrostic psalms. Now, I've mentioned this when we went through the Psalms. Acrostic psalms basically means that the first letter of each line begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So A, B, C, D, or whatever the equivalent is. 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, 22 lines. In fact, the third lamentation, the 3rd chapter, is actually a little bit more complex than that. It has 3 lines beginning with A, then 3 lines beginning with B. Okay, so not 22 lines, but 66 all up. Bit technical, but the reason for that, it is argued, is that this makes it easier for people to remember, okay, as they're recalling these lamentations. Although it also might show that, you know, when we're lamenting and grieving, there is always an end point to our grief. There is always a journey. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And as tough as it is here in the A, B, C, don't worry, the X, Y, and Z is coming. Okay, there might be something pastoral there. And then from Lamentations, we're going to head over to Psalm 74 and 79. Same deal. They're known as city laments, where the psalmists cry out to God to restore and rescue his people because of the destruction that's come upon them. Please do as you have done before and restore us after all this devastation. All right. And what's really interesting, and what's interesting about the timing of when we're reading this week, is that these Psalms, and particularly the Book of Lamentations, began to be read on the anniversary of the temple's destruction throughout Jewish history. In fact, what's a real interesting coincidence is that this temple destruction in 586 BC and the one that takes place in the days of Jesus, or the early church, in 70 AD, both happen at the same time of year, around about July, August. And so a tradition, a fast weekend developed called Tish B'Av, and to celebrate, or not celebrate, but to commemorate this event with the Jewish community. And interestingly enough, that took place just last weekend, the first week of August, if you follow me with us live. So a bit of a coincidence there. Well, that's it. I think the wind's coming in. I need to get going. A whole bunch of lamenting this coming up this week, but don't let it get you down. Okay, hope is on the horizon. Yahweh is a restorative God, and as he has rescued us from Egypt in the past, so he will rescue us again from the hands of the Babylonians in exile. But maybe not quite yet. We might have a few more weeks to go before that. All right, guys, enjoy your readings this week. And I'm going to get to some special meetings I'm here for in Canberra. And I'll catch you next week. See you then.